You did not choose to be born a woman in the ancient kingdom of Israel. You did not choose the village, you did not choose the father, you did not choose the name you would carry for the rest of your life. What you chose, or what they allowed you to choose, was very little, and even that little could be taken from you with a single word, a single glance, a single royal decree. It is approximately the year 1000 BC. Israel has just established itself as a unified kingdom. There is a palace, a king, an army, and a law. But beneath all of this, there is a social system built upon bodies, upon obedience, upon the silence of women who never had the right to say no. You are between 12 and 16 years old. Your family is poor, the kind of poor that doesn't make a name for itself in history. Peasants, farmers, perhaps the children of serfs. And today, someone knocked on your door. Someone from the palace, and the world as you knew it ended in that instant. This is the beginning. And the beginning, as you don't yet know, is the easiest part. First and foremost, you are a daughter. That is the only title you possess without having to earn it. Daughter of a man who works the land or trades in the market, who pays taxes to the king and prays to the Lord, and who raised you with the clear and silent expectation that one day you would serve another man, a husband, a family, a home that would no longer be his. From childhood, you learned the right things. Grinding wheat, preparing bread with the flour left over after setting aside the temple portion, fetching water from the well before the sun rose too high, washing, sewing, keeping silent, not because someone said you needed to be silent, but because silence was the expected behavior of a virtuous young woman, and virtue was all you possessed that was negotiable in this world. You have friends in the village, girls like you, who laugh by the well, who whisper about the boys who pass by, who dream of reasonable marriages, not glamorous ones, just safe ones. Security was the only luxury that daughters from poor families could imagine achieving. Your father speaks of you as one speaks of a promising harvest, carefully, hopefully, with the weight of someone who knows they need to extract some value from something before that value is lost. You are not offended by this. It's the language everyone speaks. It's the only one you know. What you may not know is that being the daughter of an ordinary man in Israel also means being the daughter of someone who has no power to protect you when the state decides it needs something that is rightfully yours. The palace messengers don't arrive violently. That's what's most frightening later, when you have time to think. They arrive with courtesy, with modest gifts for your father, with words that sound like honor. Your daughter has been noticed. Her beauty has reached the king's ears. She is a blessing to the family. Your father didn't refuse. You need to understand that. Not because he didn't love you. Perhaps he did, in his own rigid and quiet way. But because refusing a royal emissary was a form of insult to the king, and insulting the king was a way to die. The logic was simple and cruel as a stone. Your mother hugged you longer than usual that night. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't a comforting lie, and you both knew it. You fell asleep, listening to the familiar sounds of your house, the wind in the cracks in the wood, the distant sound of some animal on the road. And for the first time in your life, you understood what it means to lose something you never knew you had, the illusion of belonging to yourself. 3 days later, you were in a carriage with other young women. Some were crying. Some stared with a blank expression that was more frightening than the crying itself. You looked at your hands. You tried to memorize your own hands, as if you needed to remember something about yourself before arriving at your destination. The palace was bigger than anything you had imagined, but you didn't go to the king's chambers. You went to the women's quarters, the gymnasium, the harem, the place the men of the court described in hushed voices and the women from outside imagined with misguided envy. There was a eunuch in charge of your training, a man who wasn't exactly a man, castrated since childhood to serve in this place, who explained the rules with the indifference of someone repeating them for the 1000th time. You would stay here. You would learn how to behave, how to move, how to speak properly. You would learn to use perfumes, ointments, fine fabrics. You would undergo a period of purification and beautification that could last for months. The king would call when he called, perhaps soon, perhaps never. The other women in the house taught you what the eunuch didn't, that there were hierarchies here too, that the principal wife had a position you could never reach, that the older concubines would look at you with territoriality disguised as indifference, that the newly arrived young women like you were the most disposable part of the system, used if the king wanted, ignored if he didn't, kept in a permanent limbo where you were neither free nor properly protected. You learned to eat the palace food, which was incomparably better than anything you had ever eaten before. You learned to bathe in waters with imported oils. For the first time, you wore clothes without patches. And for the first time, you felt something akin to shame at realizing that a part of you, a very small, human part, found it all beautiful. At night, in the darkness of the communal dormitory, you thought about your village, whether your friend had married, whether your father had used the reward the palace left to pay off debts, whether your mother prayed for you, or had learned to act as if you no longer existed, because that was the easiest way to bear it. When the call came, you didn't feel what the stories suggested. You didn't feel honor. You didn't feel fear. You felt a kind of numbness, as if a part of your mind had decided to withdraw for its own protection, leaving only the body, which knew what was expected of it. The eunuch prepared you for hours, perfumes, styled hair, clothes that subtly revealed parts of you in a calculated way. Instructions were repeated: how to enter, how to bow, how to speak only if asked, how not to look him in the eyes unless the king looked first, how to exist in that space as an object of pleasure that had the decency to appear human. The king was a man. This surprised you in a way that's hard to explain. You had constructed in your mind a figure of a different scale, something between the accounts of the prophets and the stories your grandmother told. But it was a man, with hands, with a voice, with weariness in his eyes, with the kind of power that makes a man not even need to look at a woman with real attention, because attention was never the point. You left that chamber before dawn, and what happened between entering and exiting remained locked somewhere inside you that you decided never to fully open again. Not because it was spectacular violence, but because it was the most profoundly indifferent thing you've ever experienced, and indifference, you discovered, hurts in a different way than cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledges that you exist. After that night, your status changed. You were no longer a young woman in waiting. You were a concubine, a word that carried considerable social weight in the world you lived in. You were not a wife. You would never be a wife. But you were recognized by the palace as the king's woman, which meant that no other man could ever take you as a wife or concubine. You had been marked in a way that left no visible scar, but that everyone would know how to read. There were some concrete advantages, and you learned to cling to them like lifebuoys: guaranteed food, shelter within the palace, a level of protection against poverty you were born into. If you had a son of the king, especially a son, your position would become substantially more secure. The son would give you a recognized purpose, a bond the system respected. But there was another side, which no one needed to explain, because everyone knew it. You could no longer choose. You couldn't marry. You couldn't have a man who belonged to you, who slept beside you out of love or habit, who knew you by your real name, and not by your position in the harem hierarchy. You had left the world of ordinary women without entering the world of women with power. You inhabited a space between the two, which seemed like protection on the outside and was a gilded cage on the inside. You began to understand the older women in the house in a different way. The bitterness you had interpreted as a difficult character. The silence that seemed like hostility. It was simply the result of years of waiting in a system that promised stability and delivered invisibility. When you realized you were pregnant, the first thing you felt was relief. That haunted you for years afterward. The relief, as if a child were a solution, as if a child could solve the fundamental problem of not having control over any aspect of your own life. Pregnant concubines received preferential treatment. More care was taken with their diet, more attention from the palace physicians, men who knew how to ensure the king's children survived. Other women in the household looked at you with a mixture of envy and calculated assessment. Envy because you had achieved something concrete within that system. Assessment because the sex of the child was still unknown, and a son and a daughter were valued completely differently. You thought about your mother during her pregnancy. You thought about how she had carried you without any of the resources you now possess, in a small house with a dirt floor, with the only certainty being that your Father would be by her side when the pains came. You had doctors, ointments, trained midwives. You had no one who knew you by name before 3 years ago. The child was born. It was a boy. And for a brief period, perhaps the most illusory of your life, you felt you had found something resembling solid ground. The king's son gave you a name within the palace, not a name of power. You would never be queen, never sit beside the throne on days of judgment, never have a voice in court affairs. But he gave you a name of permanence, the mother of such and such son, a function, a reason to continue existing within those walls. For some years you built a sort of life. You raised your son. You observed the palace with the eyes of someone who had learned that survival requires constantly reading the environment. You knew who was rising in the king's favor, who had fallen out of favor, which disputes between women were dangerous and which were just noise. You learned to speak little and listen much, the only real form of power the system offered you. You even came to confuse this adaptation with peace, to confuse the absence of immediate crisis with security. It was the cruelest illusion the system produced, making you believe that you had learned the rules and that knowing the rules was the same as being protected by them. What you couldn't see, because no woman in that position could see clearly, was that your stability depended entirely on factors outside your control. It depended on the king's health, on the king's interests, on court politics, on your son's status relative to his other sons. It depended on a series of gears turning without you being able to touch any of them. The king grew old, or the king distanced himself, or a new favorite rose in the court, and resources were redistributed, or his son, growing up, became involved in something that displeased him. It doesn't matter which version is yours, they all lead to the same place. You stopped being called. That was the quietest and most eloquent sign of all. There was no decree, no confrontation, no scene. Simply, your name ceased to be spoken in places where it mattered, and the silence surrounding your name grew like a weed, discreet and slow, until it occupied everything. Other young women arrived at the palace. You saw them walk down the same corridor you had walked years before, the same frightened eyes, the same hands searching for something to hold on to. And you realized, with a kind of pain that has no proper name, that you had become the older woman who looked at the newcomers with that expression you had always interpreted as hostility, which was, in fact, just the weight of knowing. The law was clear, even if cruel. A concubine of the king could no longer marry. She could not be touched by another man. She could not leave the palace to build another life. You had entered a system that offered no dignified exit. There was only permanence, a permanence emptied of purpose, of presence, of real human contact. Your son grew up and became absorbed in the courtroom disputes, the same ones you had learned to read so attentively. You were still his mother, but that role became abstract as he rose or fell in his own battles. There were days when he would pass through the hallway, and the greeting would be the quick kind, given by someone with more pressing concerns than the woman who brought him into the world. You didn't die of hunger. You weren't beaten. You weren't thrown out onto the street. The system was too sophisticated for such obvious cruelties. You simply stayed, growing old within those walls, fed, clothed, forgotten. A life technically maintained and humanly ended. The system continued functioning after you left. That's what needs to be clearly stated before we conclude. New young women continued arriving in carriages. New messengers continued knocking on the doors of simple houses with words that sounded like honor. New parents continued saying yes because saying no cost more than they could afford. And new girls continued looking at their own hands on the journey, trying to save something of themselves before arriving. Their story was not recorded. The records that exist from that time are of kings, wars, alliances, and prophecies. The women who lived within these stories only appear when they interfere with the narrative of men, when they are mothers of famous kings, when they cause wars, when they die in ways dramatic enough to merit a line. You didn't start wars. You weren't the mother of a famous king. You didn't die dramatically. You simply lived, with the quiet intensity of someone who understood very early on that the world had been built without her in mind, and that even so, she needed to find a way to inhabit that world every day. This is not a story of villains. It's a story of structures, of systems that existed before anyone who lived within them and that would continue to exist afterward, of rules that no one created alone but that everyone helped to maintain with the cumulative weight of obedience, fear, and the absence of alternatives. Somewhere in Israel, there's a village where a girl is learning to grind wheat, fetch water, and keep quiet, where a father is thinking about the future with the eyes of someone who knows that the value of things can be extracted, where a mother hugs for longer than usual, unable to explain why. The system is awake, and the carriage is already on its way.